Hello everyone, I am Shahtaj and in this video we will be covering the histology and the physiology of the stomach. Now let's understand the histology of the stomach through a picture and then we will be going over the details of each layer. We have the mucosa, which is further divided into the surface epithelium, the lamina propria and the muscularis mucosa. Then we have the submucosa. After that we have the muscularis externa, which is further divided into three muscle layers, the oblique, circular and longitudinal, and then the outermost layer is the serosa, which means that the mucosa is the inner layer and then the serosa is the outermost layer, which means that the inner layer would be towards the lumen. Now let's discuss each layer individually, starting with the mucosa. So the mucosa actually consists of longitudinal folds known as rugae. We already discussed in anatomy that this is formed due to the mucus layer. Then these rugae are divided by shallow grooves into mammillated areas which consist of the foveolas or the gastric pits. Now let's look at the picture that the surface mucosal cells have the gastric pit that is opening into the gastric gland. That means that the pit invaginates inwards. And it is also mentioned in the text that bottom of each pit contains an opening of the gastric gland. Now the pits are shallow in the body, which means that the glands are going to be longer. Let's also illustrate it through a picture that if the pit is shallow, then that means that the gland is going to be large. However, the pits are deeper in the cardiac and the pyloric region, which means that the glands are shorter there. So if the pit is deep, the gland will be short. So this is going to be in the body and this is going to be in the cardia plus the pylorus. Alright, then let's talk about the epithelium. The stomach is lined by simple columnar epithelium. This is important. This can be asked in the exam. Now this is a mucus secreting type of an epithelium. We have the surface mucosal cells or the foveolar cells, and these secrete mucus or the bicarb. Let's discuss each cell now. That each cell can have microvilli. However, they do not form the brush border which is normally seen in the small intestine. Then we have the desmosomes on the lateral surface, and on the basilar surface we can have juxtaluminal occluding junctions, which means that we have tight junctions present between the cells of the stomach. Now these tight junctions also help creating a barrier to protect the stomach wall. Then we have the lamina propria, which is actually loose connective tissue. It is highly vascularized, which means that it is going to have blood vessels. Then we can also have fibroblasts, mast cells, plasma cells and lymphocytes, and they consist of glands in the stomach. Now let's refer back to the picture that when the surface mucosal cells are going to invaginate inwards, these glands are going to be present in the lamina propria. So the stomach glands are present in the lamina propria. We will be discussing the stomach glands in the next slide. Then we have the muscularis mucosa. It's also a smooth muscle fiber layer which consists of inner circular and outer longitudinal layer. Now the function of this is that it compresses the gastric glands, and as a result of which it helps them expel the secretion into the lumen. We have the submucosa next. Now submucosa is loose connective tissue consisting of the blood vessels, lymphatics and submucosal plexus of nerves known as the Meissner's plexus. Now we are going to discuss this plexus in the next slide. However, we can see here in the picture that the submucosa consists of blood vessels. We then have the muscularis externa, which consists of three layers of smooth muscles. We have the inner oblique muscle, we have the middle circular, and then we have the outer longitudinal layer. Now between these we have the Shahtaj plexus. Now we will be discussing these plexuses like I mentioned. Now circular forms the pyloric sphincter. Now let's understand this, that the circular layer, it thickens to form sphincters, and obviously in case of stomach it is going to form the pyloric sphincter. Then we have the serosa. Now the serosa is lined by visceral layer of peritoneum and the thin layer of mesothelium, which is squamous epithelium. And like we already discussed, that serosa is going to be the outermost layer, while the mucosa is the innermost layer and it faces the lumen. Now let's discuss the glands and the cells of the stomach. Just a quick overview that we have the cardia, which is near the lower esophageal sphincter. Then we have the fundus, the body, antrum, and then the pylorus before it opens into the small intestine. Now each part of the stomach consists of separate type of glands. The cardia consists of the cardiac glands, the fundus in the body consists of the fundic, also known as the oxyntic glands, and then the antrum and the pylorus consist of the pyloric glands. This means that the stomach actually has three types of glands: cardiac glands, fundic glands, and pyloric glands. Let's first discuss about the cardiac glands. Now these cardiac glands consist of mucus cells. Now mucus cells are responsible for producing mucus, which is thick and viscous, and it produces bicarbonate, which is alkaline in nature, which means that it is necessary to protect the gastric lining from the acid. Another thing, that these mucus cells are located in the neck of the glands, and these mucus cells are located in each gland, which means that they line the entire stomach, because the mucus layer is essential in all the areas of the stomach for protection. Up next we have the fundic or the oxyntic glands. These are the most common type of glands and accounts for approximately 80% of all gastric glands. These comprises of four major type of cells, which include the parietal or the oxyntic cells. First, now these parietal cells are the most common and are responsible for secreting HCl, which is the stomach acid, and the intrinsic factors. Now these intrinsic factors are responsible for vitamin B12 reabsorption in the ileum. Then we have the chief or the zymogenic cells, which secrete pepsinogen. Now pepsinogen is responsible for digestion of proteins. Then we have the enterochromaffin-like cells. These are responsible for secreting histamine. Now what histamine does is that it activates the H2 receptors located on the parietal cells to stimulate gastric acid production. Alright, up next we have the mucus cells. Now we already discussed that mucus cells line the entire stomach, so mucus cells are going to be present in the fundic or the oxygenatic glands as well. Up next we have the pyloric glands. Pyloric glands also consist of three major type of cells. We have the mucus cells. We already discussed that these mucus cells are lining the entire stomach, so they are going to be present in the pyloric glands as well. Then we have D cells. Now these D cells secrete somatostatin. Now somatostatin is responsible for inhibiting the gastric acid production. Up next we have the G cells. Now G cells secrete gastrin, and gastrin is responsible for activating acid production. Now this means that pyloric glands maintain a feedback loop of acid production. Before moving ahead, let's also see a picture. This is a picture of the oxyntic glands from the body of the stomach. Let's just place it here, zoom in and study. So we have the surface epithelium and the mucous neck cells. They are continuous with the oxygenatic or the parietal cells or the peptic or the chief cells. Now this means after the surface epithelium, this is going to be the gastric pit, and obviously the place from where we have the cells lining, this is going to be the gastric gland. Now you can notice here that it is mentioned that we have mucous neck cells. So the mucus cells that are located in the fundus and the pyloric gland, both of them are located in the neck of the gland, which means that after the surface epithelium, we are first going to have the mucous neck cells, followed by the specific type of cells that each type of gland contains. For example, the fundic gland would consist of the parietal chief or the ECL cells, or the pyloric gland will consist of the D or the G cells. Before moving on to understand the physiology, let's discuss the nerve plexus. We'll quickly run through it. That the GIT has a nervous system which is located in the gut wall extending from the esophagus till the anus, and this is known as the enteric nervous system, which comprises of two major components, the myenteric or the orbex plexus, or the submucosal or the Meissner's plexus. Let's first discuss the myenteric plexus, which is an outer plexus located between the longitudinal and the circular muscles. Of course, this is going to be in the muscularis externa. We covered this in histology. and this is responsible for controlling the GI movements. Now this is a very important pointer. It controls the motility, peristalsis, and the muscle tone. Let's look at the picture that the myenteric plexus is located between the longitudinal muscle and the circular muscle layers of the muscularis externa. We then have the submucosal or the Meissner's plexus, which is actually an inner plexus located in the submucosa, which is responsible for controlling the GI secretions, local blood flow, and contractions of the muscularis mucosa, which was a layer of the mucosa. We already discussed that the contraction of muscularis mucosa was allowing the release of gastric contents from the gastric glands. So in the picture, we can see that the submucosal plexus is located in the submucosal layer, which is pink in color here. Another pointer about the enteric nervous system is that enteric nervous system receives parasympathetic and sympathetic stimulation both. Now, parasympathetic stimulation is secretomotor in nature, which means that it innervates the glands. And what happens is that with the parasympathetic stimulation in either the stomach, it causes glandular secretions, which increase the local blood flow. Now, local blood flow increases as a secondary effect, which means that parasympathetic stimulation is never going to result in a direct increase or decrease in the blood flow. We then have the sympathetic stimulation. Sympathetic stimulation is actually vasomotor in nature, right? It is going to innervate the blood vessels, like the term suggests. Now, sympathetic stimulation is going to constrict the arterioles, leading to decrease in the blood flow, and this is going to be a primary effect as compared to the secondary effect seen in the parasympathetic stimulation. Now, sympathetic stimulation is activated during the fight or the flight response, or during vigorous activity when the body is trying to supply blood to the skeletal muscles and divert it from the gut. However, this does not always remain. What happens is that the sympathetic stimulation also reverses. So the reversal is when the decrease in the local blood flow causes ischemia. Ischemia results in the release of metabolic vasodilators that overrides the sympathetic stimulation, thus returning the blood flow to normal in the gut, and this is known as autoregulatory escape. So this is all we need to know about the nerve supply located in the wall of the gut, in this case the stomach. Up next, we have the functions of the stomach. The stomach has 4 major functions. It is responsible for storing food, mixing the food to form chyme. Now, chyme is semi-solid food that is going to enter the small intestine. Then we have gastric acid production and protein digestion. Let's discuss each of them in detail. The stomach is responsible for storing the food. So whenever the food from the esophagus enters the stomach, it stretches the wall of the stomach, allowing storage, and the food normally remains in the stomach for somewhere around 3 to 4 hours. Now, this mixing of food occurs due to the action of peristaltic waves. And before looking at the text, let's just understand it through a picture. Now, what happens is that we have peristaltic waves that begin in the body of the stomach, and they are going to descend downwards towards the antrum. Now, the waves present in the body are weak waves, and as they approach the antrum, they form a ring, and these are relatively stronger. And the food here is under high pressure. This high pressure is going to force some chyme into the small intestine. However, only few millimeters passes with each contraction. Now, what happens to the rest of the food accumulated here? The rest of the food is going to go back towards the body, and this is known as retropulsion. And the constant moving back of the food into the body is going to allow mixing, which churns the food actually. Now let's also read the text that we have the constrictor waves first. These were the constrictor waves, and then this was the constrictor ring. Now what happens is that these constrictor waves are slow waves with weak peristaltic activity beginning in the body of the stomach and traveling through the antrum. Progressively they become stronger. However, the contents are going to be under low pressure. Once they enter the antrum, they become strong peristaltic waves. Again, the similar pointer is mentioned that constrictor waves become stronger towards the antrum. The antral contents are going to be under high pressure, somewhere around 50 to 70 centimeter of water, and this forces several millimeter of chyme into the pylorus, and that's why we also call these waves as the pyloric pump. As most of the food is not going to pass through the narrow pylorus and only a few millimeter of chyme passes through, the chyme is forced back towards the body of the stomach. As we saw here, the green arrow is representing retropulsion. This is known as retropulsion, which allows the mixing of the food, right? So it's going to go back to the body, allowing the mixing. So this is all we need to know about the mixing of the food to form chyme. Next up, we have gastric acid production, which I'm going to discuss on the next page. Let's first talk about the protein digestion. So the chief cells of the stomach, we already talked about the chief cells and its role, are responsible for secreting pepsinogen. Now, pepsinogen is inactive, it has no digestive activity, and it gets converted into pepsin. Now, this conversion is aided by HCl, which means that when inactive pepsinogen is going to come in contact with gastric acid, it gets converted to pepsin. Now, pepsin is an active digestive enzyme which works best in an acidic pH somewhere around 1.8 to 3.5 and digests proteins. This means that protein digestion begins in the stomach. Now let's discuss the gastric acid production. First, we are going to discuss its phases. Now it has three phases. Number one, we have the celiac phase, then we have the gastric phase, and then the intestinal phase. Let's discuss each phase in detail. The celiac phase is when the gastric acid is produced even before the food enters the stomach, and it occurs when the taste, smell, and sight of the food are going to stimulate the appetite centers, thus stimulating the vagus nerve. The cephalic phase accounts for 30% of gastric acid production. Now, the gastric phase begins as soon as the food enters the stomach, and the stomach distension causes the stimulation of the acid production, and this phase accounts for 60% of acid production. Up next, we have the intestinal phase, and this occurs when the chyme enters the duodenum. This acidic chyme can cause either a stimulatory response or an inhibitory response. Let's first discuss the stimulatory response. It is the initial type of response, and as the acidic chyme enters the duodenum, it stimulates the gastrin release by the duodenal mucosa, and this results in an increased acid production in the stomach, and this accounts for 10% of acid production. Now, even though the inhibitory response is not related to the gastric acid production, we can understand by the term that inhibitory response would mean decreased acid production, and this occurs due to two major reasons. The first one is reverse enterogastric response. Now let's memorize this word. This occurs when duodenal distension and irritation of the mucosa by acid or protein breakdown products leads to inhibition of the gastric acid secretion. Another factor that leads to decreased acid production is release of inhibitory hormones, which includes secretin, cholecystokinin, gastric inhibitory peptide, somatostatin, and vasoactive intestinal peptide. Now, these three phases are going to result in an increased gastric acid production. However, after the acidic chyme enters the duodenum, it then leads to an inhibitory response that decreases the gastric acid production. Up next, we have the mechanism of gastric acid production. Let's not get intimidated by the picture. We will be going over each step in detail, but let's first understand that the parietal cell is where the gastric acid production is going to take place, and it has a variety of receptors which are located on its apical membrane or its basolateral membrane. So the basolateral membrane of the parietal cells consists of the M3 receptors. These are parasympathetic receptors on which acetylcholine acts. Then we have a CCK, cholecystokinin receptor, and H2 histamine receptor. And on the apical membrane, we have the hydrogen potassium ATPase proton pump. Right. Let's begin to understand the mechanism by first talking about the cephalic phase. We discussed previously that the smell, sight, and even the taste of food can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, and this, through vagal nerve stimulation, causes the release of acetylcholine and gastrin-releasing peptide, both of which are released from the postganglionic fibers of the vagus nerve. Now, this gastrin-releasing peptide is responsible for the stimulation of the G cells. We discussed already that the G cells were located in the antrum of the stomach, and they were responsible for the production of gastrin. Now, these G cells can get stimulated during the gastric phase as well, where the food in the stomach that causes distension also stimulates the G cell, leading to the release of gastrin. Now, this gastrin release produces a major effect, which is that it stimulates the enterochromaffin cells to release histamine. Alright, and it can also produce a minor effect by stimulating the CCK or the cholecystokinin receptors. However, we shall not be worried about this. Let's first understand the histamine mechanism of action. It is very important to understand this. Now, histamine is going to stimulate the H2 receptors which were located on the basolateral membrane. Now, these histamine receptors are associated with the G stimulatory proteins that are going to result in an increase in the CAMP, or the M3 receptors, which were getting stimulated by acetylcholine, which again was released by postganglionic fibers from the vagal or the vagus nerve, actually activates the GQ protein that increases the intracellular calcium, thus increasing the CAMP, and then as a result of which the hydrogen potassium ATPase pump's activity is increased. This means that both the acetylcholine and histamine are resulting in an increased activity of hydrogen potassium ATPase pump. Now let's proceed to understand the hydrogen potassium ATPase pump. I've zoomed in into the parietal cell and let's see what happens. So water and carbon dioxide combines together under the influence of carbonic anhydrase as the enzyme and produces carbonic acid. Now this carbonic acid is a weak acid and it disintegrates into a bicarbonate ion and an hydrogen ion. Now the bicarb ion is going to move out into the extracellular fluid, and in order to maintain the electrical balance of the cell, chloride from the extracellular fluid is going to enter into the parietal cell and move directly into the gastric lumen. Then the hydrogen ion that we discussed is going to move through the hydrogen potassium ATPase pump out into the gastric lumen, and potassium from the gastric lumen is going to move inwards again to maintain the electrical ionic balance. Another thing is that water from the extracellular fluid is going to move into the gastric lumen, and this is going to be via osmosis, because we know that wherever the ions are going to travel, the water is going to follow that. Now this hydrogen and chloride are going to meet and form the hydrochloric acid. Now this is the acid which is present in the gastric lumen, and we can see here in the picture as well that the hydrogen ion is moving out into the gastric lumen and the potassium ion is going inwards. Now this is how the gastric acid is produced. I hope this clears the concept. It is a little tricky to understand, but I've tried my best to make it a little easier. This was all regarding the physiology of the stomach. Now that's it regarding this video. We discussed the histology and the physiology of the stomach. Thank you so much for watching.